Hello and welcome to Console Shock, retro and modern gaming chat with me, Trev. Usually Stu, but this time he's on holiday at Christmas time, which is lucky him and everything. Hope you're okay, Stu, wherever you are. Instead, we have got, one of our usual co-hosts. Probably been a few episodes since you were on, but we have Al with us today. How's it going, Al?
It's going really well, thank you. How about yourself?
Yeah, good. Yeah, I mean, I was going to say it's probably been a few since you've been on. I mean, I can never remember our list of episodes off the top of my head without looking, but I think it's been like about 8 or 9 of them is what it feels like in my brain.
It feels like it's been a few now. Yeah, I'm becoming old hat.
I guess so, yeah. You're kind of part of the furniture. I mean, obviously, you've always been part of the furniture. We started this podcast and it was me and you and Stu became involved, and so it's always good to get you back on to talk about stuff and to have you as an additional voice in the banter that we have on here. But today, kind of an important time in the history of video gaming. It can almost be it spans retro and modern stuff alike. But one thing we've got you to talk about with us today, Al, and that is the 30th birthday of the PlayStation. Now, that does obviously, mean the entire brand is effectively 30. But I think we're going to focus a bit more on sort of the PS1 specifically. We might touch upon some of the other consoles, because I'm sure we've both had experiences with the later ones as well, all the way up to the PS5. But the PS1 is where it all started. So I think we're going to sort of mainly focus in that area.
Yeah.
So, Al, can you believe that straight away?
No, that's mental. That is utterly mental. Just hearing 30 years, it's like, right, I'm older than 30. It kind of makes me question, like,
just a bit.
What's my age then? And that is nuts. That shouldn't be a number. Like, everything should just like reach 10 years and then that's it. It's just like, it's 10 years old.
I think so. I think so. Yeah. I mean, I do have to drop a caveat on that, because it's not actually technically not the UK 30th anniversary. This is judging it from when it was launched in Japan, which was the 3rd of December 1994. And I do find it odd to kind of associate the PlayStation with 1994. And that's kind of a weird thing to say, but for me, that was still prime 16-bit era. That was still like me playing my Mega Drive, and later on it would have been the Commodore Amiga, but that was still, Mega Drive, either, NES, playing my Game Gear. It was firmly 2D, a 2D year for me was 1994. And I think of the PlayStation as being something that I really associate with like 3 or 4 years later. Is that do you get that feeling as well?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, it definitely was more of a 1995 thing. I remember, I do remember it launching. And I had a friend who owned one. I was still on a Mega Drive back then.
Same here. Yeah.
So it was a massive leap in stuff. It was just insane to me. Almost as insane as just how old it is now. But yeah, and I remember that PC gaming was really taking off because Windows 95 was starting to get pretty firmly established at that point as well.
Yes, it was indeed. 3D especially was really starting to come in on the PC side, Yeah, Doom had already kind of made that a big thing. Yeah. I mean, it was still a few years before we got to a situation where we had graphic accelerator cards. I think it was NVIDIA that basically introduced those. I think it was a couple of years later. I need to get my sort of PC graphics history in check, but where the PlayStation, when it landed, it was obviously way ahead of what you could do on a PC. I mean, for the price, you were paying in the UK, it would have been £300, which is quite expensive. But to get a PC that could game, I don't think people were really buying PCs purely for gaming in those days like they would do in the 2000s. It was basically, it was something you had as your either your family computer or your work computer, and it could also do games. And there were obviously game accessories, wasn't there, that you could get for the PC, controllers and, I mean, getting a CD drive would almost be an accessory like that, and sound cards, and there were different graphics cards then, although they weren't necessarily 3D accelerated ones in 1994 and 1995. But when the PlayStation came out, it was absolutely set a bar way beyond what PC was doing at the time. But if we think about our first experiences with the PlayStation as a brand, I mean, that wouldn't necessarily have been us playing the thing. It would have been just hearing about the rumors of new consoles in the magazines and the various, TV shows that we would watch that were video game focused in those days. What were your thoughts when you first heard? Again, we were both sort of Mega Drive and Game Boy and Game Gear was our sort of video gaming in 1994. Obviously, leading up to that, what did you think when you heard that Sony were basically going to jump in with a console of their own?
It was very different. It's hard to really put my finger on it, especially after 30 years. But the thing is, we grew up in the era of the bit wars, where you had 8-bit and then 16-bit, and then we're seeing a console that is able to do impressive 3D graphics, which we hadn't really seen at that level on consoles before. Because this even predates the N64, right? And
yes,
and it's and they didn't even make it clear as to like how many bits it had. So I'm like, well, how does this compare? So there's a little bit of young naivety for me there, going like, is it 32? But it definitely had this kind of feeling of this is a new player in the market, because it had always been Sega versus Nintendo. And you may have like Atari trying to dip their toes back in every now and then. But to have Sony, who you recognized as they make music players like the Walkman, they make TVs, for them to be doing a video games console, and how is it going to compete with Sega and Nintendo? Was just unfathomable. I couldn't really wrap my head around it at the time, because it seemed to just happen so quickly.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing came about because Sony were working with Nintendo to create a CD drive for the Super Nintendo. Yes. I mean, this is insane, this whole story.
It is.
And that was kind of the realm of video gaming that they were probably going to end up in if that actually came to fruition. I don't think they were ever really wanting to make their own system. I mean, it might have happened years further down the line.
That was exactly what was kind of happening, is that they'd already made it clear that they were, part of Sony was wanting to make a console. Norio Oga, I think was his name, was the president of Sony at the time, and he wasn't interested. He didn't see the value of it. So it wasn't really treated as serious. But as they were going into partnership, because they'd already provided the CD drive for the Mega CD to Sega. And so
and they
Nintendo,
already the sound chip for the SNES as well. They actually provided that for them. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, and then you've got Nintendo that they're looking at partnering with, because they're like, well, it makes sense because they've already done it for Sega. And then when they find out that Sony's got interest in doing that, they're like, hang on a minute. You're saying that for you to be doing this, like, you need to know the inner workings of the Super Nintendo. You already know the inner workings of Sega's console as well. And then you're going to make your own. That's going to give you a very unfair advantage. And I know that there was also some licensing disagreements with how things were going to be funded, because Nintendo were wanting a little bit more control with that, and they weren't going to share rights to the cartridge-based part of it. But they wanted to put a big premium on the CD stuff. So Sony would have lost out, really. And I think there was... I think it was something to do with the fact that Sony would have almost exclusive rights to the CD software, or they would get all the royalties or something. It was some small print in the contract. And, that's it. They were both trying to fight for more control and rights over the funding for things. And it really wouldn't have been a Nintendo product at all. Yeah,
exactly. And there was these issues with, the contracts and who would get rights over what. And I think Nintendo then decided, well, I don't think we can work with Sony because they're going to want too much control that we're happy to give. Let's just maybe come up with a deal with someone else and not tell Sony. and they did that with Philips.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was the most bonkers part of this, that they didn't tell them. They were so used to just brushing aside companies like Sega, that I think that just in their hubris, they probably just didn't think about this multi-bajillion-dollar corporation would have an issue with it. But it was when
we didn't think there'd be major repercussions. They probably thought, well, they'll be a bit pissed off at us, and maybe they'll sue us, but we can deal with that, and we'll move on. Yeah.
I can't remember which conference it was. It was E3 or one of those from that era, the E3 equivalent, possibly. But they went there because they stood on stage and said, "We're partnering with Nintendo to make this amazing CD add-on."
That's right. Yeah.
Nintendo went on stage and went, "No, we're not. We're making it with Philips," and that is just egg on their face, complete public humiliation. For them to go, we're doing this, and and for the public to find out that's not true. And this is in Japan. And you end up with this tale of Japanese revenge like you would expect from some samurai film. Because Ken Kutaragi, who was in charge of that whole Sony Entertainment department, he's the one who's in charge of this. You've then got Norio Oga, the president of Sony, who initially wasn't interested, going like, "They have shamed us. What do you have that we can use to get revenge?" And he's like, "Well, we've got this idea for our own console, the PlayStation." And whereas Oga, I think I'm pronouncing the name right, whereas he wanted to go ahead, he didn't want to go ahead with a console initially. He was just like, "I'll fund whatever you need to make this and destroy Nintendo." And so
exactly
bonkers that it came out the way it did. And that's why it's the PSX. That's why it was always shortened to that, because the PS, the PlayStation, was the original Sony version with Nintendo. And then the PlayStation X was their one that was supposed to take Nintendo out.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. Yeah, so obviously the betrayal happened, and then, Sony was a vendetta, really, were like, who again were fairly lukewarm when it came to video games. They had their hands in a few little bits, but nothing serious, and they were quite happy being in that place. They were betrayed by Nintendo, and I think Ken Kutaragi, he always did wanted to make a console, but he used that as leverage to basically said to Oga, "Look, let's just make we can destroy whatever Nintendo do. If we put our minds to it, we can make our own console. We make a lot of this stuff anyway." So they made a console. And they announced it as the PlayStation,
And what's interesting is that they didn't have like their own game development studio. They started buying and partnering with a lot of third parties. Like they got Psygnosis. I think they bought Psygnosis, didn't they?
Yeah, they did.
And and I don't know about yourself, but I remember just how massive it was seeing Wipeout for the first time.
Yeah, that was kind of what really sold the PlayStation in Europe, in the UK. I mean, we're talking that the launch in Japan was 1994, but, a year later in September 95, I think Wipeout was really the big game, more so than any others. I mean, I still was interested in Ridge Racer and, Tekken, I think didn't come out till about a month later. In October, there was sort of a second wave of games that came out before Christmas. But at the time of the launch, it was Wipeout, and that looked, there was no arcade game that we could compare that to. It was basically, it's derived a little bit from F-Zero on the Super Nintendo, but by God, there was nothing like it on anything, like futuristic hovercraft, the sense of speed, the graphics. It was just above like what any other console of that time was able to produce, wasn't it, Al?
Yeah, I really love that the movie Hackers used footage of like a pre-release. It wasn't really pre-release. It was more kind of like proof of concept that Psygnosis
that's right.
On. And
they provided them with some footage for that. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, so they're in Hackers. They're playing as this massive arcade on this giant screen. It's where Dade Murphy just completely obliterates Kate, who's played by Angelina Jolie, completely obliterates her high score. And it was more of a kind of first-person racer. It ended up being more of a third-person, really.
You could switch the view, but I think it was a lot easier to play in the third-person view. Yeah.
It was just fantastic that we had that level of graphics just in a home system. I think it was really quite faithful for a lot of arcades, like Virtua Fighter and Tekken, having that kind of level, that we hadn't seen with previous consoles.
Yeah, that's right. If we look at where gaming was at this point in time, it was mostly, certainly at home, it was mostly 2D. You could do 3D things on the Amiga, but obviously these were very low frame rate stuff, like frame rates in the single digits. The games that did that were obviously, made to be slow paced stuff. But there was obviously very advanced stuff in the arcade that Sega and Namco were doing, probably more on the Sega side, I would say, 93 and, well, really in 1992 was when it absolutely exploded with like Virtua Racing, which was like a polygonal racing game that was, ran at 30 frames a second. And I mean, it was untextured. Everything was just made out of Lego bricks, but it still looked incredible compared to, the 3D that we were used to. Virtua Fighter, which was from the same hardware, was then released later on. I think it was the following year. And again, that was very blocky, untextured, but again, still looked incredible. The fighting games were, nothing like that really. Again, what we were used to, Street Fighter 2, but a fully polygonal 3D fighting game looked incredible, especially on a lot of the arcade machines that I would see them on. Living by the seaside, I had arcades pretty close to me on my doorstep, basically. And I do recall, the arcades that I would go into would have like Virtua Fighter and Daytona on ginormous screens. I mean, well, these days they're probably smaller than your average television, but like, a 40 to 50 inch, rear projection screen. These games looked absolutely incredible and mind blowing. And really, there were orders of magnitude more sophisticated than anything like a Mega Drive could sort of pump out, or a Super Nintendo. I mean, they did have, attempts at those sort of level of games, 3D games. The Mega Drive got a port of Virtua Racing, although it had that SVP chip in there to help it to sort of pump out the polygons it needed to sort of, make a version of Virtua Racing that at least resembled the arcade. And it did a pretty good job, to be fair. I mean, you were looking at sort of 15 frames a second to 20 frames a second, but still, it's pretty cool to have that on something like a Mega Drive. You had the Super FX chip on the Super Nintendo, but yeah, nothing to the level that you would get in these arcade machines. So we were looking like, the next generation of consoles would really be where we'd be able to play those games at home. But when you're looking at the competitors, I mean, we know, we've just gone through it, that say the PlayStation really came about because of a betrayal from Nintendo. They decided to go ahead and make their own hardware. They had some of the CPU and all of that stuff was derived from some of their sort of PC style workstations that they were selling in Japan. They actually had those chips in there, and they used those to make the PlayStation 1. But really, we mentioned Wipeout obviously being huge in the UK for the launch in September 95, but when it came to 1994, it was basically Ridge Racer, which was what sold the PS1. And it wasn't, I mean, it was a really good port, but it wasn't actually super close to the original arcade. I mean, if you can play that now on MAME, and I do that. The original Ridge Racer was on more powerful hardware. It ran at a higher resolution. It's 60 frames a second in the arcade, whereas the PS1 version is 30, a very solid 30 frames a second. But it's obviously lower resolution, sort of 240p. But it was still looked way better than anything on any console that you could see. I mean, do you remember seeing Ridge Racer for the first time?
Oh yeah. I mean, I used to love playing that at the arcade as well. We had a Laser Quest near us, and they had a sit-down cabinet in there, and I used to play on that all the time whilst I was waiting for the next round of Laser Quest. And to see that on the PlayStation, there were other limitations, like there was no analog input for it. And so even later on, if you got an analog controller, like it still was just the D-pad that it used. But to be able to play a game like that at home was just nuts. And it's weird that I remember in my memory, I almost kind of conflated the two, that I started to think that looking back, the PlayStation 1 version was pretty much near identical, in the same way that the Dreamcast games were almost identical to their arcade counterparts. And then when you actually go back and play it, it's like, oh no, it is actually a bit of a downgrade, but not to a point that's detrimental to it, which says a lot for the longevity there.
No, I mean, it's not. We touched upon Virtua Racing had a Mega Drive port. I mean, the Ridge Racer on the PlayStation was way, way closer to the arcade Ridge Racer than Virtua Racing on the Mega Drive was to the arcade. And, you know, for the most part, people would just say it was arcade perfect. And, you know, you can't blame them really, because it was a very, very good port. Later on, it was you had some situations where Namco had an arcade system that was based on the PlayStation. I think System 11 it was called, which was literally a PlayStation. I think it had a bit more RAM, but apart from that, it was identical. And there were games, basically Tekken was on that, and some other games later on down the line, like Soul Blade, and there are a few others that would get ported. But those games would get ported to the PS1. And obviously, they would be absolutely perfect. All the Tekken games ran on those on that PlayStation derived arcade hardware. So you would literally be playing the exact same game at home, which was mind blowing when you're thinking these again were sophisticated 3D games. And it also has to be said that like 1994 period, that 1993 to 1995 period was also bizarre in the sense that there were so many consoles that came out from all over the place, from various different places. I mean, the notable ones, you know, would be the Atari Jaguar and the Panasonic 3DO, also the Philips CDI, which Philips CDI came out from that deal that Nintendo made with Philips behind Sony's back. That's, you know, an interesting thing there. There was a few others that came out in Japan as well, like the FM Towns, Marty, and those ones that we didn't really see here. But yeah, I mean, those consoles were touted as being next generation. The Jaguar and the 3DO are kind of the ones that I think of. But yeah,
the thing that's different though is that those didn't launch with any kind of feeling of staying power. They didn't feel like they were going to shake up the game. I still remember, I think it had only been out a month, the Atari Jaguar, and there was already a massive price drop in Electronics Boutique. Like, I think they were selling it for a quarter of the original price with games. And I'm kind of like, if they're discounting it that much, it can't be that good. Even at my young age at that time, like, I was still kind of looking at it going like, that doesn't seem like a good idea. And yet when the PlayStation arrived, it felt like it had the clout behind it to really change the industry in the way that like the 3DO and so on just wouldn't.
Looking at those consoles, the Atari Jaguar in particular it was touted as a next generation console, but when you look at the games, I mean, there were some 3D games. It did get a bit of a big profile kind of initial bit of buzz because of Alien versus Predator, which was, you know, a 3D first person game. It was impressive. But the 3D games, you know, there wasn't a huge amount of them. They weren't that impressive. They ran quite badly. And then most of the other games were ports of like Super Nintendo and Mega Drive games. So it kind of just really came across as a souped up, you know, Mega Drive really. And, you know, you could probably do that anyway by just getting a 32X for your Mega Drive, which was a bit cheaper, especially when those got discounted. And if you really wanted those sort of, you know, those very early 3D games, you've got a few of them there. You've got Doom on the 32X, which the Jaguar had a good version of. The 3DO, I think, was a bit more impressive because that could do pretty good 3D. Still not quite where the PlayStation and the Saturn would be. But, you know, you had games like Need for Speed, and there were lots of other 3D texture map stuff that actually looked quite impressive for 1993. And, you know, weren't that far away. But as you touched upon, the support just wasn't there. So that was always going to fall by the wayside, and ultimately it did. So there was an interesting point in time where we had these very early 5th gen era consoles that just completely failed. And I guess you could also throw the 32X into that as well, which came out, you know, around the time the PS1 launched in Japan. And by God, I mean, the gulf between the 32X and the PS1 was a ginormous chasm, really. But, like, you know, it's got some decent games, the 32X. I'd argue that it's probably a bit better than the Jaguar. Although Jaguar's got a lot of homebrew stuff coming out these days, which is very cool. I don't think anyone's really touching the 32X and making any new games for it. But yeah, it was a pretty cool. It was a cool time to be into video games because you had all these new consoles coming out, and it wasn't completely clear who would win out. I mean, I don't think anybody was sort of saying at the time the 3DO is definitely going to fall to the wayside, or the Jaguar is. We maybe had our thoughts, that this isn't going to do. The Saturn's coming out soon, and the PlayStation's coming out soon. I'm not sure how well it will do against those, but it wasn't clear that the PlayStation would destroy everything, basically.
Well, I think the other thing was that the 3DO, from what I recall, was just prohibitively expensive.
Oh, it was indeed, yeah.
Whereas
more so
the
than
PlayStation
the PS1 and the Saturn were.
Exactly. So they were more kind of. It's almost like the 3DO was like a high-end like home entertainment thing, as opposed to the PlayStation and Saturn, which were, these are home consoles. They're just a more advanced version of what you've been growing up with. So there was that. And then you've got, like, it was the year after that the N64 came out, but the thing is, it takes about a year for good games to start emerging. And so you ended up with Gran Turismo, you had Metal Gear, there was Resident Evil and Tomb Raider, Crash Bandicoot. There's all these massive franchises that would go on to develop and stuff. And when the N64 launched with 2 games, Mario 64
basically,
and
basically,
it's competing against Sony's dominance at that point. And by the time that hits its first year, we're already seeing sequels to all of these massive franchises. So it really dropped at the right time to get that kind of power.
I've spoke about this before, and some people that are huge N64 fans might not like it. Bear in mind that my first 5th gen console was an N64. I got a PlayStation and a Saturn later, so I'm definitely a fan of the N64. But I'm happy to say that, like, a lot of people have fond memories of the N64, but I feel less people owned it than actually have fond memories of it. And how that works is people would go to a mate's house to play an N64. You'd have the one mate that had the N64, and you'd go to their house and you play GoldenEye and you play Mario Kart 4-player. But you would go home to your own house and play PlayStation. I mean, I was that mate that people would come over to and play 4-player N64 because I had one. But I think more people remember it fondly because they were one of the 4 players on their mate's N64 versus people that actually owned it. And I think the numbers kind of back that up a little bit, because the N64 really only hit like 30 million consoles, whereas the PlayStation is over 100 million. So there were just way more PlayStations out there. And the N64 at the time, I think, well, we're not counting like the Virtual Boy, but in terms of home consoles, was their lowest selling one. Up to that point, I mean, they've beaten that since unfortunately, with the GameCube and the Wii U. But I mean, the N64 was kind of hamstrung by using cartridges. It was hamstrung by that basically dictated how it would work out after that. Third parties didn't want to pay for the cartridges, and it limited the library that it ultimately got.
Yeah, and I think Square Enix jumping ship with Final Fantasy was kind of the, for lack of a better term,
final nail, I would guess.
It was the thing that was the final blow in the whole revenge saga, which just had Sony winning that, and Nintendo's early decisions and Sony's perfect timing as to when they actually entered the market really is what set all that in motion. It's it's kind of weird how that kind of worked out. And with the cartridges things, I mean, the one good thing that was great about cartridges was you had no load times. But
that's right, yeah.
CDs, they did have the trade-off of now there's load times, but they were just so much cheaper. And there was something really cool about the coating that they had, where the bottom of the disc was black, like pitch black.
That's right, yeah. It was very
seen
cool
on a disc before. Yeah.
It was interesting that they chose that, or they used that look of the CDs. It was very distinctive. But yeah, I mean, people like Nintendo obviously would use that in their marketing. We don't have loading, whereas those guys do. But really, we were happy to trade off what is really quite minimal loading. For people that grew up on things like the Commodore 64 and the Amiga, which would have minutes long, and longer loading times. What essentially would mount to maybe, the worst scenario is maybe 30 seconds. There might even be a game that would take like pushing a minute to load, but I'm not sure it ever really would be that bad. It's not. We were happy to trade that off to have games that were huge and had voiceovers and video sequences and just were larger, because the huge capacity that the CD afforded. If we could have Metal Gear Solid, we're happy to withstand some loading to get games of that standard. And ultimately, that's what hamstrung the N64 and caused it to have a much smaller library that was really filled with sports and racing games. I know we all talk about Mario and Pilot Wings and Mario Kart, but that was a tiny proportion, of the library of the games. It had very few RPGs, no real beat 'em ups to talk of, apart from a port of Mortal Kombat trilogy, which is nothing to write home about. Probably the best beat 'em up on the N64. Whereas the PlayStation, and I'd argue that the Saturn probably has a better library than the N64, and that kind of brings us to the Saturn. I mean, when that 5th gen really kicked into gear, and I would say that was when the PlayStation and the Saturn were launched. I was basically on the side of the Saturn. I was a big Sega fan, I still am, but I was a big Sega fan then. I kind of wanted the Saturn to win that generation, and I think it was already on, playing catch up from the beginning, really. I mean, we didn't really know details about sales figures and politics and stuff that was going on in the background. But really, it was always on the back foot, and it didn't help itself by, being more expensive. Although you can pick at that a little bit. A lot of people do say, well, it was £400 in the UK and the PlayStation was 300, but you've got to get a game, which you've got Virtua Fighter with the Saturn included. It has its own memory card built in. So that was another, I mean, how much were those? Like £20? So, you kind of, I guess the PlayStation is still cheaper even if you bought a game and a memory card. But when you get to that point, you're only really looking at it being about maybe £30-40 difference. So it's not, it was a factor for sure, but it's probably blown up a bit more than the reality. I mean, when it comes to the Saturn, what were your sort of feelings on that when it launched?
Well, I think I've mentioned this in a previous episode already, but it was kind of almost lackluster. I think that I'd kind of seen what had been happening with the 32X, and then we're at the Sega Saturn, and I think for me it was the lack of a Sonic title which seemed baffling to me.
Oh,
We were still in the era of gaming mascots, and it's like we've got a Sega flagship with no Sonic game. It's also way out of budget for anything that I could possibly hope to have. We were always a generation behind anyway, because we couldn't really afford to get the current generation.
Same here.
I do remember playing it at somebody's house, and it was certainly impressive. I didn't look at it and go, this is a bad console, but it just didn't have as much of a wow factor that I was expecting. I think my expectations for Sega were a lot higher than what I was seeing.
I think well, probably didn't do it any favors as well. I mean, we touched upon the price was a factor, but I think people compared Daytona USA to Ridge Racer and Wipeout. And Daytona, I mean, admittedly they were porting it from a much more powerful arcade unit to what Ridge Racer ran on, which was powerful, but wasn't up there with Sega Model 2. So the Saturn was already facing a struggle to get anything that remotely close to the original arcade. So you had Daytona USA, which had really quite egregious pop-in of the draw distance that wasn't really an issue with Ridge Racer to the same degree. It ran sort of between 15 and 20 frames a second. Ridge Racer was a solid 30. So putting them side by side on someone sat next to each one and in like a shop or something, the PlayStation would already look way better. That was a huge factor, I think, in terms of marketing. People would do that comparison. That really hurt the Saturn, I think.
Yeah, there's definitely a unique look to the graphics of the PlayStation as well. The way that the textures would kind of flicker and move in a weird way, like we hadn't seen really
geometry
happen.
issues, and yeah.
And it's one of those things where there became a point, like when you're first seeing it, where you're blown away by how amazing it is. Like I remember the demo. My friend had the graphics demo that they had, where it was a manta ray and a T-Rex.
Oh yeah.
That was impressive. You know, it was basically this 3D model you could control.
Dark.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Like Jurassic Park came out in '93, so when we're still like close on the heels of that entire phenomenon at the cinema, and then we've got here's a 3D T-Rex you can control with the controller. It was really impressive as a tech demo, and there was definitely some. I'm assuming that they were shortcuts that they were making. I don't know this for sure. I don't think they've ever acknowledged it, but it feels like there were some cost-cutting things to get the console to the price that it was, because it was missing a few things. One of them was MIP mapping, which is what made graphics look a little bit fuzzier in a way on consoles like the N64.
Anti-aliasing and like texture filtering.
It didn't have a floating point unit module for it, so the way that it was trying to generate and display the graphics, along with having no Z buffer, that was all done in software, and the developers had to deal with that.
That would cause the texture warping as well, wouldn't it?
That's it.
Geometry sort of calculations.
Yeah, because basically the Z buffer is figuring out what item is in front of what other item. So basically distance from you to the far distance. And the idea is
polygon sorting and stuff. Yeah.
And anything that's obscured shouldn't have anything drawn behind it. What was happening was that developers had to essentially send to the processor, this is the item that's in the distance. It's basically drawing every polygon, which is basically just a bunch of triangles. And it's basically telling it which order to draw them in, because the Z buffer couldn't figure that out. So that's why you had a lot of warping, because it was trying to figure out which is supposed to be the one in front when it doesn't really have that information. And then the floating point unit is what it basically couldn't figure out, based on having no Z buffer information, how really to align the textures for perspective. And so it would be constantly switching them. And it would, my understanding was that it would, because it didn't have like a precise location in a 3D space, it would basically have a pixel it was supposed to snap to. And if it just went over the edge, it would snap to the next pixel along. And so you'd have things that just seem to be shifting back and forward. And you could really see this in things like Resident Evil with the characters, where if you watch those on an N64, they were really solid polygons that just seemed static. Whereas on the PlayStation, everything kind of shimmered around and you'd have weird glitchy kind of stuff. And I remember that as we were moving away from the PlayStation 1 towards the PlayStation 2 and later PlayStation 3, those kind of eras, you look back at the PlayStation, like the graphics are awful. Like they're absolutely terrible. But we've now reached that point where they've now hit nostalgic levels. And now there's people who are making shaders to mimic that look.
Exactly, that low polygon, texture warping, and you can really a good like demo of that, like for people that are just hearing what Al's talking about. You can get a great example. Basically, play one of the Tomb Raider games and just walk very close to a wall, and as you're walking past the wall, the bit of the wall that's nearest to the camera, that's nearest to your eyes, you can see the texture on that wall will sort of warp and sort of jump, look like it's juddering up and down. So yeah, I mean, there's nothing that ruins the gameplay, but it was a very distinctive PS1 thing. That kind of we kind of find charming now, but it would look a bit janky. Absolutely,
If it was a problem, the PlayStation would not have been as successful as it is. People were fine with it. I think that for textures like in Gran Turismo, where it's just mostly a flat texture for the road, you didn't really notice it as much then. But for more detailed ones, like in Tomb Raider, those walls were like really highly detailed stuff. And I think that they could have, helped it by adding more polygons. More basically breaking everything up into more triangles. But then you've got a performance hit. You got a bigger performance hit if you do that. And it is just, it's this weird thing that that was the only console to really have that kind of look to it, which is what makes it so unique in that regard.
And I actually think nowadays, when you're trying to use these consoles on, I know you can obviously play, when you want like a HDMI solution, like a PS3 is pretty good when it comes to PS1 because you can play, PS1 games on the PS3 through HDMI. And there is some texture filtering options you can have on that, or you can not have it and just have it as completely super sharp pixels that are raw. That super sharp raw look, I think it looks better than the N64 now. When you put an N64 on a big TV, even if you've got like a fancy HDMI modded one, the huge amounts of anti-aliasing and texture filtering that is applied to that image actually makes it look really fudged out, and there's no detail at all.
It's the mip mapping is my understanding for that, in that the idea of mip mapping being that the closer an object is to you, the sharper it is and higher resolution, and then as it's further away, they switch out to basically a lower resolution version of that texture, which helps a lot with performance, but you end up with a much softer image. Whereas if you compared them side by side with the PlayStation, because it wasn't using that, then you would get better draw distances and things would look sharper. I think it may have had an impact on performance, relatively speaking, but there was definitely a different look to it. And I think as well, I'm right in saying that there are some emulators that will even add things like Z buffer support to enhance the image to make it a lot sharper.
Yeah, I find that there are some really good solutions for getting an actual N64 console on a HD TV, like we mentioned, like internal HDMI mods. But I just think it just looks, the N64 just throws out such a low quality image. I don't think it looks great. I think you're better off using an emulator where you can nudge up the resolution and really get the sharpness back. Yeah. Whereas the PlayStation, obviously, it's still low resolution. It's the same resolution than the N64 for the most part. But because of those pixels, there's no texture filtering, there's no anti-aliasing. I think that raw, chunky pixel texture sharpness still looks great. Unlike again, the PS1 has HDMI solutions, and you can mod a PS1 to work on a HD TV. I think that looks. When things are sharp, you feel like you're getting the picture quality is good, and you can get that really easily with the PS1 because of the way it threw out its image. Whereas the N64, I think, just looks bad without using an emulator. Obviously, it looked great on a CRT back in the day.
Yeah, I was actually just thinking about that, because especially games like Silent Hill, which I was never personally a fan of. It's just not my kind of game. But I went to a friend's house, and it was really impressive the way that they used the draw distance to its advantage and made it kind of look like this massive fog that's there. And there is definitely a difference when you have the dithering that's provided by a CRT versus when you're looking at it on an HD TV or LCD, any kind of modern display. You lose a lot of the effect because it looks so pixelated. That this is the thing, that even though we had all this kind of weird glitchy behavior from some of the graphics, CRTs really, really helped because it was at the tail end of when CRTs were still commonplace.
Yeah, that's right. So I kind of fudged out some of those, those issues that are the image that was produced by the console. The CRT, just the nature of how it draws the image, or how it spits out the image, just helps to make a lot of those issues that you have with the PlayStation or any retro console a bit easier to swallow. I personally do quite like the big chunky pixel image that you get from old consoles, not just PlayStation, but the Saturn has also got a similar kind of output to a PlayStation that looks great. Old 2D pixel art on the N64 and the SNES, and even earlier than that, I think still looks really great. The N64 just to me looks like crap. I see these videos of people, like, I don't know if you watch these guys, and people like Metal Jesus and people like that who get modded N64s, and they show, hey, I've got my N64 to work with HDMI, and it's just the image is so soft and so undefined, it just looks terrible. I mean, I really enjoy playing N64 games, but when I do, I just prefer to do it on an emulator. I can nudge up the resolution, which helps to makes the image look super sharp. There's not really any way you can do that from a real N64 console. I mean, you can't nudge up the resolution on a real PS1, but because the image is pretty sharp as it is, it looks good, regardless. But then with emulators, you can use DuckStation, which is a great emulator for the PS1, which, you can add texture filtering and you can nudge the resolution up. You can even overclock the PS1 CPU. So games that are a little bit, didn't hold their frame rate, you can have them run better. So you can do some great things with PS1 emulation as well. So, yeah.
Yeah. Did you ever have... I don't think it was available on the original PlayStation. I think it was on the PS1, the sort of the smaller mini version, which was kind of cute, actually. I still prefer the design of the original, but the PS1 did have quite a cute look to it. But that also came with, well, you could get like an LCD screen that attached to it.
You could indeed.
To make it kind of portable. And did you ever use one of those and see what the graphics were like on that?
Yeah, I've got one. Yeah, I've still got it to this day.
Oh, nice. Okay.
It was a really good screen. It still looks pretty decent and to this day. It was basically a small, I think it was 4-inch or 5-inch screen that connected to the smaller PS1, the revised PlayStation 1. And didn't quite make it a portable console, but made it something you could maybe take around a mate's house, or I don't know, if you're on a train with a tray and a plug and a full, power jack. You could connect to that and you could play PlayStation 1 games on the go. I do remember people bringing it into my sixth form common room and playing games, PS1 games at school with this screen. But yeah, it's pretty good. I mean, on the PAL version, you do have to deal with the big PAL borders that we got, on pretty much every PS1 game that wasn't PAL optimized. But the screen, it was a Sony. Obviously, Sony made TVs, so they had access to really high quality screens. And you could use it to this day, and it still looks great. I'd recommend getting hold of one if you want a cool little retro portable PS1 that you can move around.
I always kind I always kind of imagine that for kids who perhaps live between homes, or they go to spend time with their grandparents, it would have been a lot easier to cart that around, especially not having to worry about having to hook it all up to a TV.
Exactly.
It had like built-in speakers to it as well, so like it made it a really good. I think this is the thing, that consoles have always had accessories, little attachments and things. Sony seemed to do a really good job at some of their first-party peripherals, like the controller. They pretty much nailed right out of the gate, and then when they added the analog controllers and later the DualShock, like that is a design that has stood the test of time because it's still the design they use today for the PlayStation 5.
Yeah, so, I mean, they kept it identical really, and moved it up to the PS3. The shape and the size and it was identical. I mean, they modified it a little bit, didn't they, with the PS4 and now the PS5? But yeah, the basic outline hasn't really changed much, has it?
No. Whereas we've seen like Xbox had a very different launch controller, the very big bulky one. Same with the Saturn and all these other consoles. They tend to just start with a very bulky controller and kind of slim down. If anything, the PlayStation controller bulked up a little bit just because of the analog controls. But other than that,
that's right.
Really been pretty much standard for the entire line. Then you had the memory cards as well, which didn't they start at like 512 kilobytes or something like that? It was something tiny.
I think it was less. It was 128. I think.
128. Wow.
Yeah. They're interesting because a lot of the CD consoles in that kind of awkward 93 to 95 early 5th gen era, so like the CD32, the 3DO, the CDI, their solution, and also the Sega Saturn, their solution to dealing with saves is they would have a small amount of memory in the console. So the Saturn, in particular, that had a small amount of memory inside the console, so you didn't have to buy a separate cartridge or a card to save your games. You could just do it with the console. That was limited, of course. You would eventually run out after, you only really needed maybe 10 or 12 games, and that would easily use that up. Some games even would wipe out the whole thing I think SimCity 2000 on the Saturn. I think that would use the entire internal memory. There was like a cartridge you could get for the Saturn that plugged into with a cartridge slot, not surprisingly, that was a memory expansion, so you could save games to that, and that was way bigger, like 8 or 9 times bigger or something than the internal memory. So I can see why an external memory card for that time, for that era, that probably was the best solution. I mean, they weren't cheap, but you could just you weren't limited by how much memory you had inside the console that couldn't be upgraded. You could effectively upgrade how much save space you have with those memory cards. You just kept buying them. What were your thoughts on those memory cards?
They were really durable and quite compact. And I did eventually get a PlayStation, and I still remember being surprised at just how small the capacity was. But even then, obviously I was getting some of the newer ones. I just thought they were built really well, and it was very different to the days of my Sega Master System and having to beg my parents, please don't turn it off. I don't want to lose my progress. I need to leave this console on overnight so I can continue on with my game in the morning.
Exactly.
Whereas this was permanent storage, and the interface for it was pretty decent as well. And I mean, that was the thing with the PlayStation is that the BIOS that they had for it was kind of neat because it was a CD player. That's another thing that made the PlayStation such a big thing. Is it was a CD player in the same way that the PlayStation 2 became like the cheapest DVD player you could get at the time. The PlayStation 3 was the cheapest Blu-ray player you could get at the time, and they kind of followed that through. But when you didn't have a disc in, then you would get this interface that would allow you to just browse the memory card, copy things over. So having the versatility to copy your save games and back them up was fantastic. And when you had like an audio CD, and it would just go straight into the CD player for it. Actually, I think it went into the CD player even if you didn't have a CD in, just ready for you to insert one.
You go on. Yeah, sorry.
I was just going to say. You go.
Okay. We're so excited about this. We just can't stop talking about it. It was really cool. Like the BIOS there, and you could. You obviously had access to the memory card manager, and you. The good thing about the PS1 is it had those 2 slots under the controller port, so you could have 2 in at the same time. Which is a decent. If you had them both and they were both being used, it was a decent amount of memory. I think pretty much every game would look at the second slot as well. I think there were some that required it to be in the first slot, which was kind of annoying. But I think most would sort of be able to access both of them. So you could just keep 2 memory cards in there. And you've got, that's a decent amount of save space. There were some games in most games would maybe use a block or 2 blocks out of the 15, I think, that you would have. But there were some games, I remember I had Premier Manager 98, a very exciting football manager game on the PlayStation 1. And I think that used up the entire memory card. So you'd have to get, by that time though, when we get into the late 90s, there were third parties that were making memory cards that were like £10 or something. So you could persuade your parents to pick one of those up. The official Sony ones were still like 20 or 30 quid. Probably more reliable, and really the ones you want to get were those Sony ones, but they were fairly cheap to get third party ones at that point. Then you had that, and then there was the CD player, and there was later versions of the BIOS actually had cool little sound like visualizers that you could turn on when you were playing a CD. Do you remember those? I
do. I remember a friend of mine was DJing at a birthday party with a PlayStation, and he asked me to help him out. I'm like, okay,
That's cool.
I don't really know what I'm doing, but okay. And he just had a massive TV that he bought from home, set that up with a visualizer, and he'd have me flipping through to get the next CD ready to pop in and things. And that's cool. How he was running it. Yeah, it was really ghetto, but at the same time kind of neat that it was using a PlayStation just so we could have all the visuals and stuff. Yeah. One thing that I found out recently is because I was looking at a website called sounds-resource.com, and that's where a lot of people have ripped a lot of the sounds from various games. And the BIOS for the startup sound for the PlayStation, which is iconic and probably one of my favorite startup boot sounds.
Oh, I love it. It's great. Yeah.
All time. Yeah, is actually not a single file. It was multiple. When you go on, they've actually stripped it into all its bare elements, but it turns out it's 3 sounds. And what they did was they overlaid them. They would have them run at different speeds, and they were able to just take these 3 tiny little sound bites and stretch them out to make that entire intro. And the little sort of dingling noises that you get at the end only came up if there was a disc in. So it worked as a way of, it's kind of like the Power On self-test, where it's basically confirming that, yes, the hardware is working and it's detecting a disc. And you wouldn't have that little dingly chime at the end. If it didn't, it would just go into the CD player. But that is just ingenious. Given how long that audio track is, the fact that it's not an audio track in the traditional sense is nuts. And again, like that was, I think, 512K for the BIOS. So it had to fit in that.
Yeah, and that was the actual, I mean, you don't really hear it a lot, I guess, but the actual Sony, the actual PlayStation 1 sound chip was pretty good. And obviously that would be producing the audio for the boot up. Obviously it wasn't the CD that it was able to get that from. Most games would tend to just use, orchestral music or music that was basically just being, came from the CD, whether it was there was part of the CD that was an audio CD, literally, an audio spec CD, and there was a data layer, and then there'd be the audio tracks. Later on, I think they would use, they would compress the audio as audio files like MP3s, because the more of the disc would actually end up being used for the game data. So that would change. You knew you had a game that you could use regular CD DA, I think would be what I'm talking about, or audio, because you could put that in a CD player, like Ridge Racer you could, and you could listen to the audio tracks. Later on, you couldn't do that because they were part of the game data, because they were compressed audio. But you wouldn't really hear, a lot of games wouldn't just use the PS1 sound chip. I think Resident Evil 2 did. So some of those sort of little tunes that would play when you were walking around the police station, especially, were actual PS1 sound chip. That it wasn't a song it was playing from a recorded track.
So basically, kind of working like a MIDI piece of music. Exactly.
It was kind of basically like a MIDI piece of music. The sound chip was just interpreting and then playing. But yeah, that's probably where we heard the sound chip the most, was in that boot up. And I don't think any of the subsequent PS1 boot ups are quite that exciting. It really felt like this was a multimedia sort of serious entertainment unit. It wasn't like a cutesy, kind of like the Dreamcast boot up. It's quite a cutesy, playful little like BIOS booting thing. It's still cool. I'm not saying it isn't cool, but that really felt like it was a serious piece of hardware that wasn't for kids. The PlayStation. Yeah,
I think, and this is the thing, that you had kids growing up with like the Sega and Nintendo, and it's like, this is now this is the big boy one. This is, you're in your teens, you're a young adult, and this is not aimed at kids. So you'd end up with a lot more adult titles in terms of video game violence and things like that. That's why we'd have stuff like Grand Theft Auto, which I still feel looked better on the PlayStation than on the PC. I still preferred the PlayStation part of it. But the music, especially, there was, and you'll know this better than I do, but I do remember a friend having one of the football games. I think it was one of the FIFA ones, and they had Blur's Song 2.
Oh, FIFA 98.
That was FIFA 98. Yeah. Okay, see, I knew you know exactly which one. But the fact that you got music from Blur as your intro, it was incredible. It was the thing I loved most about that game, being that I'm not really a fan of football. But even things like Wipeout, they had some really cool tracks, because a lot of the music was by Cold Storage. And I didn't find this out until I think only like a couple of years ago. The version that we had actually had some songs that were only exclusive to the PAL version. So in the UK, like we had,
I think, didn't we? I started.
Yeah, because we had. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we had Chemical Beats by the Chemical Brothers. There was a song by Left Field and one by Orbital. So there were some exclusive tracks that were on there. But it was the fact we were getting CD audio music, which was only really starting to become a thing on computers. And to have that on console was just unheard of. What was that like on on the Saturn then, because I never got into the CD audio side, if they included CD audio music on that, or did it have like its own CD player, or was that exclusively the PlayStation that had that functionality?
Oh, the Saturn had quite a fun BIOS sort of section, if you want to call it that, as well. So it obviously have a little boot up screen, which most people probably would be familiar with if you're into retro games, but it's kind of like shattered bits of, an image would fly past the screen and then all form into the Sega Saturn logo, which is actually kind of cool. It had a different sound effect that went with that, whether it was a Japanese console or a UK one. I think we had the better sound effect, actually. But if you didn't have the disc in, it would go to like a CD player. And the CD player
did have that, okay. Yeah.
It did have that, yeah. And to be honest, they weren't that much dissimilar, the PS1 and the Saturn one. Just that obviously the appearance was different. It was kind of made to look like controls in a spaceship cockpit, was what the Saturn kind of CD player was going for. And it didn't have a visualizer, but you could like have the controls you could hide the controls, and it would show a spaceship, like a 3D polygonal spaceship traveling through space. Not particularly, doing it to the music or to the beat or anything. It wasn't like trying to visualize the actual audio that was being played. It would just be flying around. If you had it on in the background at a party, it'd be a pleasant little graphic. But if you put in a game disc, if you took that CD out, put in a game disc, it would ask you if you wanted to start the game. But you could also use that BIOS to go into the internal memory manager. The Saturn also kept the date and time, which the PlayStation didn't. So you'd have to set the date and time. There was a little CR2032 battery that was in the Saturn. You could replace it very easily. It wasn't soldered down or anything. But that was what would keep the save games alive, and also the internal clock.
Makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. I don't know if any games specifically used the clock for anything in gameplay. I think there might have been one or two. I think some games would maybe unlock sort of Christmas stuff if it detected the date was Christmas. But I don't think it was very common. I think it was mainly to timestamp your saves, I think, is really the main use for it. But also the PlayStation didn't bother keeping the time. But it was an interesting thing that the Saturn did. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a shame that more wasn't done with that kind of stuff. But again, when you think about where we come from, like from the 16-bit era, that still would have been pretty new. And I think people were also just trying to figure out, now we've got all the space, how do we use the space? And
yeah, that's right.
There was probably already a lot of work just going into the amount of graphical overhaul that they were doing. Then to suddenly add let's add like a Christmas theme and an Easter theme may have just been way too much work at that point.
I think a lot of studios were still trying to get used to making 3D games, weren't they? And that was a learning curve for them.
Definitely,
worry about any sort of frivolous stuff, or whatever you'd want to call it, like that.
Well, I think like around that time as well, because of that very reason, we started to lose the bedroom coders. The idea that a game could be made by like a team of like one or two people, and suddenly it requires a whole studio to build a game because of the amount of work that was required for something that was, made in 3D.
Kind of the beginning of where we are now, where games cost so much money, they're like Hollywood films. That was probably where that really started to ramp up. It's interesting that you would mention that, actually, because I don't know if you remember this, but there was Sony did release a programmable PS1 called the Net Rose.
Yeah, that was the black one, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. It looked awesome. Yeah, I wish they made that as an option that you could just buy, a black PS1. As in not a Net Rose, just a regular, standard unit that was black. It was cool. It was kind of like matte finished as well. It wasn't like the smooth kind of plastic. It was an interesting sort of slightly rough feeling matte finish. But basically that was a PS1 that I think connected to a PC, and you would you basically have some software that Sony provided on disk. I think it was probably DOS software at that point in time. And you could program games for the PS1. They had to fit within the 2 megabytes of RAM that the PS1 had. But tons of games were made, and often they would end up on cover discs, like the official PlayStation magazine in the UK. the demo disc. I've often have a selection of Net Eurose games. Some of them are pretty good, like 3D advanced games.
That magazine is where I found out about it, because I've still to this day never seen one in person. I think I've seen some YouTube videos at some point down the line.
Yeah.
But whilst it was an active current generation console, the PlayStation Monthly magazine is where I found out about it first.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen one in the flesh either. I mean, they do pop up on eBay and they're about £1,000. They're quite rare. Yeah, it was about 700 or 800 pounds back in the day because of all the extra stuff it had, and sort of the PC connectivity. And it was also region free, I think, so the actual PS1 unit that you got. So you could like basically burn copies of games. Although, 1996, I think, when it was released, or 97, CD burners weren't as prevalent as they would become really a couple of years later. So Sony probably weren't too worried about it. Plus, it was cost prohibitive, really, to buy a Net Eurose just to do that. But you would have they would have those games that people had made on the cover discs. I think Devil Dice, which is an actual commercial PS1 game, actually was originally a Net Eurose project that someone made, and it got picked up by a publisher who liked it so much, and I think they just enhanced it, slightly, and it became an actual commercial release. Which is pretty cool. Nice. Yes, Devil Dice. Yeah, I just looked it up, was a Eurose game. That's one example of where you could go if you became a programmer on the PS1.
This actually makes me think of something, and that's that this might just be more of a perception thing, but I feel like, having been into many stores over the years during the lifespan of the original PlayStation, and even seeing a lot of games in retro stores now that it is a retro device, a retro console, I feel like there was probably more PlayStation 1 games than there was for any other console out at the time. I feel like their library was massive because it seemed to always be the largest section, whether it was just down to PlayStation was just the better selling console, so let's just stock the shelves more with those games. I don't know, but it certainly felt to me like the library was just a lot larger compared to, like, say, the Saturn or the N64.
Oh yeah, by many times. I mean, I don't know. I think there was about over 1,000 PS1 games. I think the Saturn probably ended up at about 600, although nearly all of those would be in Japan because it was fairly successful in Japan. Whereas the N64, I think, probably about 300 games, I think, at most. So yeah, the PS1, absolutely, getting a full collection of that if you're a big video game collector is quite a challenge. Because there would be stuff that was more obscure. Plus, there was a lot of versions of games. I mean, one great thing about the PS1 is you had that PlayStation Platinum range, where
I forgot about that.
Game would be £20. A game that was maybe a couple of years old, get re-released under the Platinum range label, and it'd be £20, which is very, very cheap. When only just a couple of years earlier in the cartridge era, the Mega Drive and the Super Nintendo, a game would be, would start out at £60, and in a sale, maybe you'll get it about 40. So if you had to buy 3 or 4 games of what a Super Nintendo game would cost only a few years previously, was pretty cool. In terms of a library, it was an incredible selection of games, and the volume alone is insane. And to be honest, if you're a collector these days, they're not that expensive. A lot of those, especially the common games like your Metal Gear Solid and your Tekkens and your Ridge Racers, still fairly cheap. If you look, obviously you got to be careful with the disc getting scratched up, but that's one of the hazards of CD-based consoles, isn't it?
Yeah. What did you think to the cases? Because that always becomes a thing, is how games are packaged. And the PlayStation 1 had a very unique kind of packaging to it.
Yeah, we probably got the worst ones again, because in Japan, which happens a lot of the time with consoles. I think in Japan they did get similar cases to us, which were the fairly chunky, sort of, not quite a jewel case, probably about the size of a couple of jewel cases, weren't they, stuck together? But they were fairly compact and small. They did start out with basically the whole sort of front of the case would have the artwork, and the PlayStation logo would be very small in the top corner, like a corner box, like you have on a comic. And I think ultimately the marketing over in Europe decided that the PlayStation logo wasn't prominent enough, or they were worried it would get mistaken for an audio CD. So that's when they started putting the big black strip in the bottom of the artwork with the PlayStation logo quite large.
Yeah.
So we did get that. The actual box itself didn't change. They were very brittle, though, unfortunately. The hinges would often break. And in America, they got basically just regular audio CD dual cases, which are a little bit more sturdy and, more compact. But the thing is, in Europe, we have to have very large manuals. Not these days, but in those days we did, because of the different languages. Yeah. So often we would have to develop our own boxes for these. Obviously, that wasn't a big of an issue in the era of cartridges, because those boxes were quite bulky already. Mega Drive obviously had these like big clamshells, which are probably the best video game boxes ever, really. Very, very durable. The SNES had just, cardboard boxes, which are a little bit more brittle, but you could fit, a good sized manual in there. When we got to the CD era, I think everybody struggled a bit to come up with the ideal solution for Europe. The Saturn got those pretty awful cardboard and plastic cases that would never close properly, and the disc would fall out inside and jiggle around. They did make more DVD style cases near the end of the life of the Saturn, but that was, a very small percentage of releases would have got those near the end. The N64 was still cardboard boxes, but we probably got the short end of the stick. They were better than the boxes, but they were still fairly brittle. I mean, most of mine that I have survived, and you can fairly easily just get replacements. Just buy some a cheap game to get a new one for whatever game you want to replace a case with. And there were games that came on multiple discs, and they would just come in actual audio CD. The larger clamshells that would hold more than one disc, they were just the audio CD cases. They weren't special PS1 cases. But I think America got the better option, because they just had plain audio CD cases.
Interesting. I think it might just be nostalgia talking, but I really like the design of the cases for the original. I also do prefer, and again, this is probably because it's what we grew up with. I mean, you're always going to skew more towards that, because a lot of people in the UK prefer the UK SNES, whereas a lot of people in North America prefer the North American SNES. It's down to what you grew up with, right? But I do like the PlayStation band being at the bottom, whereas I know on the North American ones, it was on the left side. That's right, yeah. Like I said, I think initially, the first couple of years of the PS1, it was just the logo in the top corner. And then I think 97, about the time Rage Racer might have been the first one. This is about March 97, I think. Yeah. That was the first game to have the band at the bottom, the logo band. But they kept the corner logo. Now I think it does look good. I would have been nice if they kept it. There was more art, more of the actual game artwork was visible, like the first couple of years of the PS1. Yeah. But I mean, I had the same thing with the PS3 when they had the old Spider-Man font for the PS3. Oh yeah. And the games sort of would come in Blu-ray cases, but you just have the strip down the side that would have the Spider-Man PlayStation 3 font. And then later on, they went to the kind of rubbish PlayStation font that they still use to this day. Which is the strip went along the top of the cases. I'm kind of, I'm nostalgic for the old Spider-Man font for the PS3. But they were cool cases. They were pretty good for CD. We got some in the Dreamcast. Got similar cases that are even more brittle. I think the PS1 cases were actually better. But it's funny how like cases can be nostalgic as well, isn't it? Yeah. What were some of your standout games that you always kind of think of? Like if somebody just sort of mentions PlayStation 1, like what are the first games that always pop into your mind that give you those fond memories? Yeah, there's probably a few actually. We'll probably use this to wrap up actually, because we've gone over a little bit over our usual running time. But for me, I think it'll be beat 'em up games. It'll be Tekken 3, which is the best of the Tekkens that came out. Really amazing game. Best fighting game, probably one of the best of that era generally. Ridge Racer Type 4, I think it's probably my favourite racing game. Gran Turismo was brilliant, but it leaned a bit too far to the simulation side for me. I preferred the more arcade-style racing games. I still do. That's why I still love Ridge Racer 7 on the PS3. Kind of the last really genuine arcade racer that ever came out.
So Ridge Racer Type 4, brilliant. But all the Ridge Racer games are great on the PS1. Metal Gear Solid, one of my favourite games of all time, and then probably the first modern video game in terms of it being so cinematic and basically like taking part in a movie. And that's kind of what it felt like. Yeah. And sports games, obviously, big fan of football. So I really loved, probably my favourite is ISS Pro Evolution. But there were so many sports games, quite a lot of football games, the FIFA game, especially FIFA 98 was really good on the PS1. World Cup 98 was good as well. And yeah, there's a ton of others I'm sure I could list off. But Wipeout 2097 is another really good racing game. Time Crisis, really great port of the arcade game. The Light Gun for the PS1 was great as well. What about you, Al?
For me, games like Grand Theft Auto. I never liked the second one. I always preferred the first one. Driver was always a big one. Then the Oddworld series. Yeah, Abe's Odyssey was fantastic. I just thought it was such an adorable character to play, and such a wonderful cinematic
platformer. I think wasn't
exactly,
it?
Yeah. It felt like a next generation platformer. It really did.
Yes,
Jackie Chan Stuntmaster I actually found as a fun one. That was one that I rented a couple of times.
I hear about that all the time. People always say that's really good. Yeah.
Yeah, because they did motion capture on him, so it's just him doing all these fun moves. And I was really into Jackie Chan films at the time, but definitely worth checking that one out. I thought the Cool Borders series was good. That was one of the first games that I ever played on a PlayStation when I was over at my friend's. He was really into Cool Borders, and so we played a lot of that.
Yeah, they were pretty good. There's a whole bunch of them. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I did also like a lot of the tie-ins for things like Tomorrow Never Dies, and there was the Mission Impossible game as well. So it's a lot of games like that. And one other one was Bushido Blade.
That was great, yeah.
One of the few fighting games where you had a character with a sword that could actually use the sword. Like it was a genuine sword fighting.
You could die with one hit if you hit the person right. Yeah, you could die instantly. Not like a fighting game where you hit people with swords for an hour and you're still there's not a single cut.
Yeah.
It was really good. Yeah,
yeah. One of them when he dies, he would always go "Oh makasata," and I spent years just wondering what that meant. And I found somebody who spoke Japanese, and apparently it just means I lose. So you get stabbed, you just like I lose, and then fall over dead.
Not quite as exciting as you might have thought it would be, but yeah,
it wasn't. No, it's like that's it. Oh, but yeah, it sounds so great though. It's makasata. Yeah, but yeah, it's one of those systems that has such a fun and, as we've already said, expansive library of games, and it's astonishing to think that this is 30 years old already.
It is. Oh, and one game that we probably should mention because of our other podcast, Star Trek Invasion on the PS1.
Oh yes, yeah.
Basically a shooter, like a third-person space shooter, which is pretty good. Michael Dorn and Patrick Stewart are in it, so yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for the Star Wars folks, they had Rebel Assault 2. Star Trek Invasion, not a great Star Trek game, but
not really. No,
put a Star Trek game on a console. It is challenging, and I think as a first attempt, it was actually pretty good for like a 3D space shooter, because you couldn't have done it the same way as on a PC back then.
It was also, I think it was the only PS1 Star Trek game, weirdly enough, even though that was kind of in the glory days of Star Trek in the mid to late 90s. So
yeah, and PlayStation 2 only had one as well, so it was
that's right, yeah.
kind of a
funny time.
Yeah.
Well, as you say, Al, 30 years, it's hard to believe it's gone by. I still really enjoy PS1 games. I still play them. I still discover new PS1 games all the time. So hopefully, our discussion has got you excited to play the PS1 again, or any PlayStation. It's kind of a celebration of the PlayStation brand in general, whether you like the PlayStation 2, the PS Triple, or even the more recent PS4 and PS5s. We hope you can jump on one of those, whichever one you have, and celebrate the 30th anniversary of the PlayStation. So, Al, we don't only work on Console Shock, we do have another podcast. Where can you find us there?
Yeah, so you can find our latest series called Subspace on all the major podcasting platforms. You can find out a lot more about it over on our website, which is longrangesensors.com.
Cool. And as Console Shock, you can catch us on all the various podcast catchers and social medias. Just search for Console Shock and you'll find us out there on the interwebs. But thank you, everybody, for listening to the latest show. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll catch you in the next one. Take care.
Bye-bye.